You are listening to Lovely Talks Heavy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lovely Talks Heavy. I am your host, Lovely, and I discuss everything I enjoy with regard to heavy music. This week's episode is going to be an exploration of album covers by genre. The imagery that a band presents forward on their album covers, in their promotional materials, etc., can be just as important as the music contained within them. The album cover can be essential to informing what might expect to hear in the album within, or maybe perhaps the album cover is just really appealing to your visual senses and is what led you to see what was on the inside. Joining me in this conversation today is MJ Alexander, who is way more qualified than me, I feel like, in talking about this subject matter. Thank you for joining me on the show today. Before we get started, why don't you let the people know?
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Why don't you let the people know what you do and sort of why I kind of brought you on here?
Oh, okay. Well, I have a degree in fine art, and I do a lot of illustration and comic art. I have a web comic called The Stoop Gallants, and it's like a fantasy adventure comic. So, yeah, I'm really into sort of visual medium, and especially visual mediums that have like a narrative or a storytelling aspect to them.
All right, so that's kind of why I brought you on. A bit of background on sort of how we knew each other beforehand. Remember a little cartoon called Metalocalypse, folks? We sort of were in that sort of fan community, and we sort of met each other through that. So I thought it would be fun to have MJ come on here and talk about some heavy metal album art. So why don't we dive right into this fun little exploration? So first in our genre by genre exploration of album art, we have doom metal. This was a fun bit of exploration research point for me because I've been telling myself, oh, I should get really into doom metal, try to really get into it and try to understand it. But musically my mood has just been, oh, let's only listen to speed metal and thrash metal and fast and manic. But no, as far as just researching this, this was a really interesting. As far as doom metal goes, I think you absolutely cannot forego talking about Black Sabbath. They're the sort of starting point, not only for heavy metal as a whole, but for doom metal specifically, really informing the sort of ideas and tones and sounds that really take over that sort of subgenre. When we talk about Black Sabbath, I think about, as far as the album art goes, you're really borrowing from psychedelic imagery, especially in their initial band logo. Their eponymous first release, I think about that grainy texture in the image, which later Doom releases would probably use to suggest that we're just all gonna fucking die and rot, mate. That's what Doom metal is all about, though. It's just that sort of hopelessness. It's there's no real hope, and we're all gonna die, and, what are we gonna do, man? We go on to the album volume 4, we have this image of Ozzy Osbourne where the image is just sort of completely yellow, but it's on a black background, so there's this high contrast, which is, I think, also very important in doom metal album art imagery, which also there is also some more of that graininess in volume 4. We move to Master of Reality. We have a wavy font in the logo and album title, which is, again, borrowing from the psychedelic imagery and this idea of, I don't know, I said psychedelic, so it's like, kind of making things interesting to look at when one may be high or stoned, or that's the same thing, or drunk even. So it's like, I think it's very colorful, very grainy. So this is the sort of starting point for all of doom metal imagery, which we now move on to Candlemass, another sort of pioneer, sort of definite pioneer in in doom metal. We think about the a very classic album, Epicus Doomicus Metallicus, which has that high contrast grainy look with just only 3 colors used throughout the whole album cover: red, white, and black, obviously, and this sort of skull impaled on a cross. Though after that, the doom they kind of steer away from that and follow more fine illustration look. They don't get that high contrast grainy look again until their 1998 album, which I really don't want to attempt to pronounce because it's so difficult sounding. But it's just black and white contrast on their studio albums for the most part. After that, we think of also King of the Grey Islands, which is just a black and white, a little bit of gray, skull wearing a crown on there. Finally, as far as doom metal, I want to talk about Electric Wizard, which they really lean into the psychedelic imagery really hard with wavy text, the high contrast images and text again, and just trippy imagery on their albums. This was like sort of my main pursuit as far as research. Was there anything you wanted to add as far as what I brought up? Or
yeah, I'm looking at this one Electric Wizard album. Is that Satan smoking a bong? Because that's amazing.
It looks that is definitely Satan smoking a bong.
Like, it's just, I feel like this is, there's like this sort of grim, dark, there's Satan and some kind, like, there's like, I don't know if those are like hooded figures or trees or something in the background. Like, it feels very like metal, satanic, but then he's smoking a bong. Like, that's the most 70s idea of metal that I can possibly think of,
Absolutely. One thing I didn't write down, but I do want to bring up now that I just thought about it and remembered it, is just the idea of witchcraft. I think is pretty present as far in doom metal, and we see that on some album covers as well. I'm seeing it right now in one of these Electric Wizard albums, 2 of them, if I could argue. So, but yeah, so that's doom metal. Let's move on to the next genre. Have fun guessing what it'll be in this transitional break. So I brought up thrash and speed metal earlier when I talked about researching doom metal. So we're talking about thrash metal in this next segment. And to kind of keep things simple, and it's still pretty I think pretty detailed research as far as I think. We're gonna stick to the big 4 of thrash metal, because when we think of thrash metal, we definitely think about the big 4, Slayer, Metallica, Anthrax, and Megadeth. Every time I list off those bands, I am always about to forget one. Oh shoot, there's 3. What's the other one? Oh yeah. So we so I'm gonna start off with Slayer, the one band that everybody loves. There's this we know what Slayer's about, the sort of depiction of hell, just blood and skulls and Satanism, just whatever any other band was doing before. Probably Slayer's just yeah, let's be way more overt about this. You see a lot of the color red in Slayer albums, because that's sort of this classical idea of what hell and Satanism is about, of course. I think there's a lot of twisted versions of biblical imagery in the Slayer discography. Just, especially in the album cover, the original album cover for Christ Illusion, I could say, which is literally the image of the Bible being with nails in it and blood on it and Slayer's logo emblazoned on it, where it's not so it definitely it kind of is something that challenges your if you're like sort of comfortable in whatever belief system you are, like no matter how one might feel about Slayer, I don't particularly care about Slayer myself, but it is definitely something that it is definitely something that challenges one's ideas of their belief system or how they feel about certain things. And it maybe calling that into question might make one feel a bit uncomfortable, to say the least.
Yeah, it's interesting to notice that there's so much religious imagery in these Slayer album covers, because when you think about it, this stuff was made in like what, the 70s or 80s. And it I always have to remind myself that it was a lot more controversial back then to make something like this. Like, this was really going against the grain of like popular culture.
I want to say, I also want to correct myself. I said Christ illusion with the Bible being nailed into, and the Slayer, that was God Hates Us All. There's so many album covers. I'm so sorry, guys. Like I said, I'm not a fan of Slayer. Anyway, I will say one of my favorite.
And they all have like religious.
Yeah,
you know. Like...
Yeah. So... no, but anyway, and I think one of my favorites out of these though, it has to be their newest album, Repentless, just because the look of it just so reminds me of remember when that lady just completely unauthorized restored, quote unquote, that image of Jesus, and it looked nothing like the original. Like,
oh yeah, that was in like what was that?
Yeah.
Yeah, God, I want to look it up now. I know exactly the painting you're thinking of. He looks like a cute little monkey or something.
Yeah.
Like, and yeah.
That's what it so makes me think of. It
like
looks
she thought
so
she was gonna restore this old painting.
That. Yeah, it looks.
I think it's the like empty eyes.
Yeah, mainly the empty eye for sure. It definitely the Slayer's Repentless is more finely detailed than that, of course, but it just reminds me so much of it. So, I think overall with the Slayer album covers though, I think they tend to be just sort of difficult to visually navigate and really do require exploration of finer details in the image, because there's not a lot of contrast happening in them. It like, because again, you have this sort of color red throughout a lot of them. So yeah, that's the Slayer portion of this talk. Let's move on to Metallica. I think out of all of the thrash bands that we're discussing here, they are the only one, I think, whose logo has remained as inconsistent as theirs has, changing from 2 dimensions to 3, having more handwritten look, and just being sans serif Metallica, just spaced out a lot. Like their image has definitely, image and sound has evolved a lot over time. But we're talking about album covers here, so all their albums are pretty iconic in imagery, though I think that is more due to their everlasting presence in heavy metal. Their first 4 albums, so we're talking Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice for All, they look pretty creepy in some way, referencing, that's a funny way to say that word, death or justice. Though Ride the Lightning makes riding the electric chair look badass in a way. I definitely want to talk about Load and Reload. They have the same exact composition, pretty much, with the Metallica logo at the time, just put in the upper left-hand corner. I had to think about that for a second, and then just the album title in the bottom right corner. Though there's different images going on in the rest of it. You have a mix of pig's blood and semen, and then Load and Reload's just something spacey and hot looking in there. I think we have Saint Anger, which is pretty graphic, just mostly red and sort of comic looking. Death Magnetic with the coffin in the ground. That's definitely one of Metallica's album covers that really sticks out in my mind, because it was one of those albums that came out when I was in high school and was really exploring music at the time and really getting to know heavy music. It looks like just sort of metal flakes forming around in a coffin shape. more infamously referred to as like a vagina. We get on to Hardwired to Self-Destruct, which is very challenging to view with the human eye because you have these images of the band's faces layered over each other and compiled into sort of a singular form, making the brain struggle to recognize where Lars's face ends and James's begins. It's a fun little thing, and I really like that album cover and that album. Let's move on to Megadeth, which, out of all the thrash bands we're talking about, they are one of two that I think are really, like, when you think of thrash metal, like, this is sort of who you should follow in presentation on the album covers, at least. Like, this is really what screams thrash metal to me. Out of all of these bands also, Megadeth is one of the only ones in thrash, I should say, that has a character that sort of persists on these album covers. Vic Rattlehead, of course, whom we know and love. The more iconic albums and also the more recent albums, I think, are pretty eye-catching because of their deliberate use of color. There's very particular color schemes going on, I should say. They're like a detailed, fine illustration, but when I think of these albums, I think of the graphic element in them. They're pretty similar to Anthrax, who we're gonna talk about in a second, wherein they have very hyper-real looks about them, but there's something distorted or cartoonish about them that removes you from reality. If you think about Rest in Peace, it's a very detailed album, but you mostly think of the color blue. I think that's what sticks out for me at first. Or if you think about Peace Cells, you think orange. So it's that's something that really sticks out for me as far as Megadeth goes. So finally, we're going to talk about Anthrax, who I researched first, but they're last on the list. This is definitely what screams thrash metal to me. Like, this is, like, follow Megadeth as far as your album art covers goes, but definitely take some notes from Anthrax. It's very hyper real again, with Among the Living, Spreading the Disease, and State of Euphoria, but there's like something cartoonish definitely going on in there. Their covers steer away from the style after State of Euphoria, but then they return to that style in 2003, though after that they start to feel more fantastical than cartoonish. And there's also seems to be a theme of arms outstretching, reaching towards the Anthrax logo in a fit of worship, which I think, like, that's a really cool thematic idea happening with these Anthrax albums nowadays. Before we move on to power metal, do you want to add anything to that? Or
yeah, just looking at these album covers, it's interesting that like the Megadeth logo almost has a similar look to the Metallica logo, and the serif kind of like the font gets a little wider at the ends, and the serif kind of points downward. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think I would say Metallica wins for being like really iconic in just the layout and the imagery. I do really like Megadeth's album art just because I am a sucker for like high quality illustration. I like that they have recurring characters throughout all of their albums. I think that's a really cool concept, and the way that they present him changes over time. So yeah, I'm really into that. And yeah,
let's move on to power metal. This is where you'll get to have a spotlight now.
Okay. Okay, so in looking at power metal, each band sort of has their own kind of way of doing things. Some of them use recurring characters, like, for example, Iron Maiden. Their cover illustrations almost always feature Eddie, who's like this undead character. And it's really interesting because sometimes they portray him like he's in like a slasher film or something, or other times he's in this like futuristic sci-fi kind of environment. And it's just interesting to see the way they put him in all these different situations. Each one kind of looks like it could be the cover of like a pulp fiction novel. You know, you go to the used bookstore and there's all these like old fantasy novels with all these characters and these like wild situations. It almost feels like they're kind of pulling from that. They're pulling from like horror movies or like science fiction or fantasy to like get the concepts for this album art, which is pretty neat. And I think a lot of the themes are also reflected, you know, in the music.
It's basically a lot of what Iron Maiden really likes, and just like, oh, let's write a song about Dune, or let's write a song about Lovecraft. It's basically like, yeah, whatever we like, we're just gonna make Eddie go there, and it's gonna be our own personal sort of Doctor Who, except it's Eddie, and he's in the future now.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think that's exactly what they're doing, and yeah, I mean, I guess we could also talk about Blind Guardian doing kind of a similar thing, because like, if you look at all their album art, a lot of it looks like it could be the cover of like a Dungeons and Dragons box set or something. Like, it's all, you know, you can tell that they're really into fantasy, and that's kind of like what they're playing up in their album art. It all looks like, you know, it all looks like they're in the middle of a D&D campaign, or, you know, it's like Lord of the Rings fan art or something, especially with their album Nightfall in Middle-earth, which, you know, literally has a scene from the Silmarillion.
Literally Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's kind of cool when bands, you know, you can tell like what they're passionate about, and they kind of like tie that into their music, and, you know, like their interests are reflected in the music, which is probably like their fans probably read the same books and watch the same movies. Yeah, and then what else did we look at for power metal? Judas Priest. Maybe less fantasy, but definitely like embodying the idea of like power in power metal. Like, they have a lot of really dynamic artwork on their album covers. They do a lot of different things. Like, they have, you know, like a fist on their album card, or like album cover, or like motorcycles or fallen angels or like demons. So there's like fantasy elements, but it's like very dynamic and powerful, and yeah.
I think as far as metal goes, like, they really definitely use this like sort of metal texture the most out of all these bands. So we're talking about power metal.
Yeah, that's true.
And like, I think, like, we brought up the idea of fonts. I brought up the idea of fonts earlier with doom metal, and this sort of idea of like there's tends to be like a lot of psychedelic imagery and stuff, and there's like I think there's a lot of that same idea going on with power metal. And when I say power metal, it's like these are clearly like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden especially are definitely like bands that we think of as just like sort of classically heavy metal, but they definitely are sort of part of the foundation for power metal, with like the screaming high vocals and just like epic sort of fantasy adventure, or whatever you want to call it. So I think this is what qualifies them to be power metal here.
Right. And I think
but the idea of fonts, though, like, when we think of Iron Maiden, we think of that, like, the Iron Maiden logo, that font that's just so that classic shape, also with Judas Priest and that logo. And like, literally when the newest album came out, there was like this sort of, oh, put your name in the Judas Priest font generator, which I thought was cool. And like, well, and Blind Guardian, like their logo has definitely persisted over time, I think that's accurate to say. So I think that's something important to think about too. Like, Blind Guardian might not be as like sort of dynamic or movementy or whatever you want to call Iron Maiden or Judas Priest logos, right. But I think everybody has their own sort of look, which I think is important too.
Yeah, and Blind Guardians is like, once again, because they're focusing so heavily on like fantasy and stuff like that, I think it kind of fits more with the themes of what they're singing about versus the other bands.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah, and like, all these themes are like, you know, if you look at any other like power metal band, you sort of see similar kind of things. Like, if you look at a band like Edguy, I think they've got similar themes going on with their album art, in terms of like, you know, illustration that looks like it could be like part of like a fantasy book or a science fiction book. Like, yeah, similar
logo to Iron Maiden's, if I might be so
yes, very similar.
But, yeah. So yeah, let's move on to the next one then.
So we're going to be looking at symphonic metal, which is similar to power metal, but with a lot more operatic vocals, a lot more sort of classical sounds, maybe a little bit softer. Yeah, so I guess the first band we need to talk about is Nightwish, because, you know, they're pretty influential. What's interesting about Nightwish is that they originally started out, they were going to be an acoustic act, and then Taria's voice was so powerful that they were like, okay, no, we have to make this a metal band. Like, we can't. She's like taking over the guitars and the drums and everything. And I think
we have to fill in the sound of proportion to her voice.
Yeah, and I think you can kind of see their roots like in the album art, because it's a lot more, you know, we've been looking at a lot of album art with like blood and skulls and, you know, death and chaos, and Nightwish albums are a lot more sort of like nature and harmony and, you know, waterfalls and the ocean, and, you know, if there's like a person there, it's like a, you know, beautiful woman or like a child wishing on a star or something. Like, it's very like, you know, peaceful. Yeah, so it's sort of the album art definitely sort of reflects the musical themes, which, you know, is pretty much gonna be the same for every genre that we look at. So if we look at
that's sort of the idea of genre, isn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, and then if you look at other bands within the genre, something that I noticed, which is really interesting, is that it can kind of be broken down along the gender lines of who's in the band, because I was looking at Therion, and they fall into the sort of the grouping of symphonic metal. And I was looking at bands like Within Temptation and Epica, which are both female-fronted bands, and Epica and Within Temptation use a lot of imagery of women on their album covers. Like, they'll have like a picture of a woman, and there's like other stuff. There'll be like fantasy outfits, or, you know, like outer space or something. And then Therion doesn't have any pictures of women on any of their albums until 2012, which is when they get a female vocalist. So it's almost like putting a female figure on the album is like an advertisement for like what kind of vocals you're gonna get, which is really interesting.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I didn't ever think about it like that. So, so you have here, like, we should discuss the idea of whether female vocalists, or the idea of female fronted, especially within symphonic metal. That's probably like the one place where, in metal, one of few places I should say, where it's sort of expected that there is a female member somewhere in there, if not at the front, somewhere. Like, if this idea is like, if this is like sort of how it is, or if it's effective marketing, or if it's like a gimmick.
Right.
I think, like, there probably are some bands that definitely use the idea of women, in their band, like, as a gimmick, like, oh, look at us, we're women, we do guy stuff, like no, yeah. But I think with symphonic metal, I think it is like one of the places within metal as a whole where, it's where voices, like the female operatic voice, can be really utilized, like, and if you think about metal as a whole too, like, it's this idea where things can be like ugly or distorted or not as quite beautiful, but when we introduce a woman to that equation, it's like our standards are still kind of the norm. It's like, well, why aren't you hot? Why don't you sound good or something? Yeah. That's probably my thoughts. So but like, women can definitely use their voices in a powerful way in symphonic metal. Like, of course, you see women using death growls and stuff in bands like Sisters of Suffocation or in Sinaya, that sort of thing. But it's where you can really exercise your voice to be the more typical opera, I think.
Yeah, well, it's also interesting to compare sort of different genres of metal in terms of, okay, so there's symphonic metal. I find that symphonic metal is very much like sort of the standard would be, you know, to have a female vocalist, and then the rest of the band members tend to be male, and they're the ones that play instruments.
Mm-hmm.
But the other genre of metal that I really like is folk metal, and in folk metal you actually get a lot of female instrumentalists. You get, you know, Encifrum has a keyboardist who's a woman, and Elvedi has a couple of female band members who play instruments. Arcona actually, like, they have a woman who sings, but then she's also like the one that writes all the music. And so it's interesting that there's sort of like different
those different dynamics.
Yeah, it's just sort of, it's interesting. But then even in folk metal, you know, even though you get more women in different roles, I've found that, for example, with Elvedi, they've gone through a few lineup changes, and they still make sure, like, okay, so Anna was the hurdy-gurdyist. They make sure that their next hurdy-gurdyist is still female. And I suspect that that's that probably has to do with, like, fan expectations. Like, even if a band is sort of like, well, we don't care if it's a man or a woman, I feel like some bands might end up getting, like, pigeonholed a bit into, like, oh, well, our fans are going to be disappointed, or we're going to lose fans if we don't have this certain look to the band, or we don't have this certain dynamic.
Which there are a lot of people that say that they don't care, really, but they do. They really do. They want to pretend they don't, but they do. Like, come on, guys. Just say you do. It's fine.
And there's a lot of people in the comments on YouTube who are definitely not shy about saying what they want.
That's always the one mistake I made, because just reading YouTube comments. Like, guys, I just want to enjoy this Children of Bodom cover of Britney Spears.
Yeah.
Let's talk about black metal. Black metal is quite interesting, I think. If anything, like, if there's one thing about black metal, it is just so challenging to just in so many ways to listen to look at, to stomach morally. If these guys Nazis, do they Nazis, do they want me dead? I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of that is, like, intentionally difficult, right? Like, a lot of this was made intentionally as, like, a countercultural, like, they're trying to be the opposite of whatever was popular metal at the time, which was the 80s, which was very, like, kind of, there was a lot of, like, superficial hair metal kind of stuff going on.
A lot of melody and a lot of cleanness, a lot of things that are very pleasurable. Pleasurable to the ear, I should say. Probably pleasurable sexually too. But that's the one thing about black metal, is definitely prides itself on making itself inaccessible or very challenging to process and to understand, you know, from that sound quality and indecipherable logos, and turning contrast on images to 11, just making Fenris looking deep fried on an album cover, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and, like, when I was looking at this, I noticed, because I was looking at, like, all of these album covers as part of this research. A lot of it looks like old silent films. Like, if you look at Nosferatu, or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or the old, like, the film Faust, like, they're all very, like, high contrast, very low resolution. Like, you almost, like, can't really see most of the details in any of these shots. And then black metal album covers look, like, so similar, where they've just upped the contrast to the point where you're like, okay, I can see a face and not a whole lot else.
Right. Does that say Dark Throne? I think that's
I think it's just a bundle of twigs in the corner.
Right.
Yeah.
Like as far as like being able to read logos, if they are ever at all like decipherable, it's always that like old Gothic sort of font, old English or whatever it's called font.
Yeah.
Like Bathory, for instance, is that's sort of the first thing I think of. I think Burzum has used that too, as much as we love Argvikernes here. but but after a while that still makes it difficult to read because everything's just this consistent shape and size, and it's like, okay, is that a M or a Z? I can't tell anymore.
Yeah.
I'm in pain here. So
yeah, the difference in line thickness, like with that sort of like the calligraphy of it, kind of makes it a little difficult to figure out like what's going on.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I think Venom also had that font too, didn't they? When they had the black metal album, literally titled Black Metal.
Oh yeah. Actually, I'm looking at it now. Okay, their album Black Metal looks so similar to the Bathory album with the goat on it. It's like
yeah, which I think there was apparently some like speculation on whether or not Quorthon was basically copying whatever Venom was doing with Bathory. So, but there was still a lot of things to love about Bathory that was brought forward. So I think
also it's interesting, like if you look at Bathory album covers, they sort of like they really do bridge this gap between like black metal and folk metal, because you know, like they've got albums that look definitively black metal, but then you've also got other albums that are a little more colorful, or they've got more like illustrations and pictures of like Nordic landscapes. So it's interesting to see that kind of like transition.
Yeah, like with Blood, Fire, Death, they were really introducing this Norse mythology into metal, and so that's what people would probably consider the first true Viking or folk metal, no, Viking metal, I should say, album.
Right.
Because Viking would probably imply a bit heavier than folk, like heavier elements. I think that's I think we have nothing else really to add for black metal, do we?
No, I think we covered everything.
Okay. So we have reached probably everybody's favorite genre, nu metal.
This was everyone's favorite when they were 12, let's be honest.
Oh, absolutely. like this is this is like the stuff that like
this is like the hardest thing you'd ever heard in your life up until that point.
Oh, absolutely. Like I was so scared as a teenager to listen to Slipknot, for crying out loud, and then when I listened to it I was like, I have never been so understood by anybody in my life ever. I still love Slipknot, of course, but gosh. So
I love their masks. Like, I think that's such a cool concept for a band, is having that like
that performative element.
Yeah, like that persona. I don't know, I think it's cool.
And then the problem with having a sort of mystique or persona on stage, people just immediately 5 seconds after are like, okay, I wonder who's behind that. Let's start searching everywhere and photographing people. Like, okay, that looks like the guy. Gosh. Like, even though, like, for example, okay, we're gonna get back to nu metal in a second, but even though, like, all of, like, Lordi's faces have been put on the internet for all to see, they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm in a mask. So okay, let's start. Okay, so nu metal album covers have this sort of, or like, it's like interesting because nu metal is like the like probably as mainstream as they come, as far as like even when it first came out in like late 1990 something, early 2000 something. But it's mainstream, but it's definitely like it still had like had some like creepiness added into it. We talk about as creepy as white dudes with dreads rapping over guitars can be. But okay. We're gonna stop making fun of this.
I mean, it's interesting because it does cross genres, and so you're going to see a lot of kind of mixed imagery in there. It's not just going to be, like as we saw with, for example, Slayer. All of their album covers have this like a picture of what I'm assuming is hell with like some demons and lots of like blood and fire, whereas nu metal is like, yeah, there could be blood and fire. There could be a white dude with dreadlocks. You just don't know.
That's the scariest thing imaginable. White dude with dreadlocks. Post Malone is coming for all of us, and we cannot stop him.
Ghost Malone, more like Ghost Malone.
Oh. Fun fact. As much as I don't care about Post Malone, he is apparently a big metal fan. Because he was spotted wearing a Power Trip shirt once, I suppose. And was talking about it. Okay, for real, let's talk about the album covers though. So when we
actually, you know what? Actually, let's hold on. I wanna pause on this for a minute because that's really interesting. Because I bet he was listening to this same stuff, and then unlike us, who like kind of drifted more towards like regular metal, I wonder if he sort of looked at the rap side of that and was like, oh, I want to like lean in like this other direction.
Maybe like there's a lot of like with like a certain like a crowd, I think like more hardcore or thrash or something like that, there is a tendency to like rap, so it's like right. There's probably something like that going on there. So so anyway,
okay.
When we talk about nu metal, when we think about nu metal, we always we can never not think about Korn when we think about nu metal. So I'm gonna let you lead this conversation now.
Okay.
Let us not stray away again.
Okay. Let's talk about Korn and their album covers. They have a lot of creepy imagery of children on a lot of their albums. They really just took that theme and ran with it. Everything from there's like one of their albums, there's like a picture of a girl sitting on a swing, and then it kind of looks like there's like a shadow of a stranger who's approaching her, and it's just got this eerie feeling of like, oh, don't talk to strangers. There's the one that I always think of when I think of Korn, which is the girl, she's like playing hopscotch, but it's like she's about to fall off a cliff. Yeah, exactly. And there's like that sort of, there's one that has that creepy voodoo doll in the front, which makes you think of like dolls and children's toys. Yeah, it's just lots of stuff that's like you can tell that there's something off or there's something like bad that's about to happen. The fact that it's always like happening to children makes it like super creepy. Like it, they don't need to bring Satan in or hell or anything like that. It's like, no, like remember that thing that happened to you when you were like 7, or imagine your fear of like being abducted by a stranger.
Right.
So I would actually say it's like their album covers are actually pretty powerful on that level.
It's probably something taken straight from like horror films, perhaps, because there's a lot of tropes with like either creepy children or bad stuff happening to children, like or children being used as conduits for evil or something like that. Like it, like if like we like bad things can happen to the adults all day long, but like dogs and children, let's stay away from them, please.
Yeah.
like yeah, we can kill these adults all we want, go for it, Mike Myers, but please just not the children, please. He has so much to live for. The adults do. So like then let's talk about Disturbed, because that's another one we think of when we think of nu metal. as far as like having a persisting character on album covers like Vic Rattlehead with Megadeth or Eddie with Iron Maiden, you also have the Guy for Disturbed. Like, that's his name, literal name, the Guy. He's just a creepy shadow muscly dude who just grins menacingly on Disturbed albums covers. He's and like I think of what was it? I think it was just called Indestructible, that album. Like, he's just kind of walking among fire. I liked 2 of the songs off that album when it came out. I forget what songs were they. Indestructible, title track, was pretty catchy tune. Okay, let's not roast me if you want to roast me at Lovely Metalhead. And there's also Inside the Fire, which is I think like we can talk. I think there's more on Disturbed really kind of have prided themselves on this, or David D. Rayman at least have really consistently went for this idea of like insanity or psychological instability, because in many music video, David Draymond's always in like a straitjacket, and it's like, look how dark and twisted I am, or something. It's like, we're making so much fun of new metal. Like, we're trying to take this seriously, I promise. But let's also talk about the root of it for a second. New metal, like, which if you've watched a what was it called, Metal Evolution, I think you could probably discern that it's rooted in collaborations by rap groups with rock groups. So Anthrax with Public Enemy, and Run DMC with Aerosmith. Like, I think when you take the like rap group out of the equation, or say when you like just sort of blend the two in just one entity versus two entity coming together, like, and trying to present that thing as dangerous, it's a different dynamic versus like with Anthrax and Public Enemy and Run DMC with Aerosmith. That's a lot to say at once. It definitely feels like a lot like these two are just sort of having fun, and with Walk This Way by Run DMC Aerosmith, like they're coming together like, oh, look at us, we're different, but we can have fun together. So, but like 2000s though, Limp Bizkit and Korn and Disturbed and all these other groups we like to make fun of in a sense, or retroact or look back on ourselves liking it, being like, oh, I was so not cultured. It's like, this is what we considered dangerous at the time, which it probably was for a lot of people. Like your grandma would probably be clutching out her pearls or something, but I think that's like a different dynamic to say, like, bottom line, different dynamics. Which you agree. Okay.
Yeah, and it's probably, there's definitely that desire for like kids to want to listen to something that's gonna like shock their parents, and you know, that's definitely a sign of the times. You know, like what I was saying with the Slayer, you know, having all this satanic imagery in the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
like that would have been really shocking at the time. And so, you know, having like rap and using it as this like shock factor in their music, you know, says a lot about, you know, public opinion at the time, unfortunately.
Yeah, and like even now, probably there's probably some sort of, let's say it, racist root in this sort of thing. Like when we like we like to definitely make fun of all the white dudes in dreads and all that stuff, but like at the time it feels like they're considered more genius for using these elements of rap music in mixing it with rock and being like, oh, this is revolutionary, this is legendary. But when we start to talk about like actual rappers, rap people, rap groups,
Yes.
there's something supposedly lesser about the art form. It was like, okay, guys, just say you hate black people and move on. So
yeah,
I think so. Yeah. Let's stop making fun of new metal now, and we'll just go and talk more about other metal.
Yes, new metal has enough coverage from us at this point. All right, so let's talk about folk and Viking metal.
This is one of your primary pursuits in this research.
Yes, I like your note here. Power metal, but this time we're in the forest. I like that.
Literally, I was messaging a mutual friend of ours, also from Metalocalypse fandom, Rebecca George, who also designed my logo and is just amazing and stuff. Like, I was talking about what we were gonna do here with her. She's like, yes, power metal. It's like in the forest and stuff. Also folk and Viking metal. She's like, shit, that's what I meant. So, sorry to roast you, Rebecca. We love you.
Well, I mean, she's correct. Yeah.
But there's something different about the folk and Viking metal. There's like a different there's another element going on with the folk and Viking metal over power metal. So let's talk about what sort of pervades the album covers for folk and Viking.
Okay, let's see. So I think Ensiferum, like, to me, does the best job of kind of invoking like folk metal on their album covers. They use a lot of. It looks like they use the same illustrator for all of their albums. Like, it's the same kind of like illustration style, and just like Iron Maiden and who else? Megadeth and Disturbed. It looks like they've got the same character on every album. It's this like guy with like a white beard. He's like this older guy. He's usually portrayed as like a warrior, or maybe someone who's also very wise. Sometimes he's like riding a horse or standing over a battlefield. But he's always got like the same like helmet and shield, and you can kind of tell that it's the same guy. He looks very much like he belongs in some kind of like Finnish mythology. I don't know if they were trying to depict like a specific character from the Kalevala, or if this is just like their kind of unique character, but it's like you can tell that there's this like running theme here of like, Vikings and, epic battles,
right.
Which is pretty cool.
It could be a mix of both too. Like, it could be their own character that they were like this like idea of like inserting oneself or one's like ideas into an already existing property. People have been doing it since the end of time.
That's true. Yeah.
So it's like, so it could be something like that too, which I think might be interesting.
Yeah, like one of the things I really like about folk metal is that you get all these different flavors of it, because a lot of these bands are from different countries and they're taking inspiration from sort of what's local, and so you get not just different musical sounds but also different visual looks, which is pretty cool. Like if you look at Elevati, they've got a really heavy focus on like landscapes on their album covers, lots of mountains and Celtic symbols because they're from Switzerland, and so obviously mountains. Teresa's leans into like battle imagery and Viking stuff. Fintroll is interesting because not only are they folk metal, but they've also got this sort of troll theme going on where, and like this is sort of a narrative in like the music itself, but they've got this theme of like trolls and like explorers like being attacked by trolls or finding trolls. I've been to concerts where like the whole band is dressed up with these like long ears, and they've kind of got their own characters based on this concept, which is pretty cool. And also
probably
like very
probably another band that would play Dungeons and Dragons with Blind Guardian.
Oh, for sure. I feel like not just Dungeons and Dragons, they'd be like full on LARPing in the woods. Like
absolutely.
Yeah, like they've got like the whole outfit and everything. Yeah, what's also interesting about Fintroll is like I think like their bassist actually does a lot of the album art, which is pretty cool. So yeah.
That's all we have to say about folk.
That's all.
That's all we have to say about fucking Viking. I'll talk about oh no, that's for Ensiferum. Never mind. Let's move on.
Okay. I mean, I could also mention Arcona, which is like my personal favorite, and they're from Russia, and like all of their album art is just like Slavic mythology, like it's the most Russian thing you can imagine.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. So yeah, I think folk metal is probably folk and Viking, or folk in general, I should say. Viking's a more specific a specific mythos,
right.
where but folk definitely is like the sound can change based on the sort of locality, which I think is kind of interesting. So
yeah, and it's cool like also that they often combine like traditional folk instruments with, you know, the regular like heavy guitars and things like that.
Absolutely, though sometimes that might be conveyed in a live setting with the keyboard. So, but
yeah.
So let's move on to the next genre here. Transition. Talking about death metal. Death metal, I think, universally, well, not universally, but people love death metal. It's accurate to say death and dying. Shit, boy, I die. Main theme in death metal.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of different approaches to how death metal album covers are illustrated. Like one of my favorite death metal album covers would have to be the latest Carcass album, Surgical Steel, where it's this photograph of all these surgical tools just sort of laid out in a circular pattern. And there's something about that just feels very graphic, despite the fact that it's like there's not so much contrast happening in that album cover, but it like just it feels so simple, and yet at the same time it's like you can't help but look at, just as you go in the circle of all the different tools, it's like, okay, scissors, butcher knife, scissors, hammer, scissors. Like I just love that.
It's also cool because it's very suggestive,
yeah,
compared with like a lot of the other death metal album art, which you know is a lot more blatant,
a lot more overt, a lot more blood, and the album titled Gallery of Suicide and that sort of thing. Let's see, you have like some interesting comparisons of Cannibal Corpse that I want you to sort of expand on, which I really love here.
Oh yeah, so I was looking at Cannibal Corpse album covers and just sort of doing comparisons between their album covers and art I've seen before in like sort of art history. Specifically, if you look at the work of Hieronymus Bosch compared with like something like The Wretched Spawn, you can see Hieronymus Bosch uses a lot of detail in his work. It looks very chaotic. There's a lot of stuff going on, lots of like demons running around, like sort of crawling into each other, or like being birthed out of each other, or just like general chaos. And if you look at something like The Wretched Spawn, it's got a very similar vibe where it's like it's a very like busy composition, and you've got this sort of alien coming out of like this woman's body. Or if you compare something like Gore Obsessed, you've got these limbs reaching out of the ground to grab at a body. You can find similar comparisons in depictions from Dante's Divine Comedy, where there's like limbs sticking out of the ground in the same kind of horrific way. Like it's like people, I guess in the Divine Comedy version, it's like people's feet are sticking out because they've been like shoved in the ground head first. But it's this it's just this idea of hell as being like the worst place ever. It's not just like blood and fire. It's like, no, think of something that's actually really fucked up, and that's what hell is.
Like we're like there's a lot more suffering than just being here. Like we are suffering, we are dying over and over again.
Yeah, like someone's been very creative with this. Someone had time to like think it out.
Right. It's like despite like what one might like not initiated would think, like this is a lot of these album covers are typically actually things that the members, mainly Alex Webster, who's the bassist of Cannibal Corpse, it's stuff that he particularly finds terrifying. Like, you know, it's interesting to see, I think, and I think that's a lot of in the lyrical content too, even though that might be shocking to even some of us, but still. When we talk about death metal, I want, like, you have some really cool notes on Death and Morbid Angel that I just want you to briefly expand on, before we start to close out here.
Oh, yeah, yeah, so for Death, I noticed they've got a lot of, like, illustrations on their album covers that, once again, like, it looks like it could be on the cover of, like, a Pulp Fiction novel. They do become more abstract as time goes on. Yeah. No, I'm just
I
looking.
think there's a lot of
my
consistency in the title, there's a lot of consistency in the style of Death album covers, I think. Like,
yeah, it's very like very like similar to like Megadeth or Iron Maiden in like the sort of illustration quality.
and then you have Morbid Angel here, which you've compared to Salvador Dali, it looks like. Like,
oh yeah,
Formulas Fatal to Flesh. Let's take a look at that real quick. I forgot this keyboard's not working.
Okay.
But
yeah, I'm like going through my notes, like trying to figure out what I was talking about before. Yeah, well, they've got a lot of similarities to like, I want to say like Black Sabbath in some cases. Like, if you look at Domination, it's got this weird like green and purple kind of like acid trip kind of look.
It's a very saturated color scheme. I'm looking at it now. So,
yeah.
Which there's probably, compared to doom metal, there's probably a lot more saturation in color schemes. Not just in death metal, but probably everything else too. Where like, doom metal, definitely is more grainy and probably more muted. And like, while there's some like finer details going on a lot of stuff, there's still a lot more, and you still have to like try to navigate. It's probably safe for black metal, I should say. You can still like pick out like very definite things happening here. So
yeah. Okay, I've got Formulas Fatal to the Flesh pulled up, and yeah, I can see why I said this was Salvador Dali kind of looking.
The great thing about research, you write down notes, is like, yeah, I'll know what I'm talking about with this half completed thought, and then you go on, it's like, what the fuck was I talking about? So let's transition on, and we'll do our final thoughts here. All right, so we've navigated all of the genres we decided to navigate here. That was a lot of work, a lot of interesting exploration. Again, I think it's like so interesting how like different our particular research methods were, where I was looking for more consistency in the discographies, like, okay, what are the overall themes within each of these bands? And then you took it a step further and were like, yeah, let's look at some actual art pieces and really use my fine arts degree here.
It's gotta be useful for something, I mean.
Useful for coming on a podcast and talking about metal album covers at the very least. So that's something.
It's good enough for me.
One final point of discussion I wanted to talk about is it's to bring up this question on, is it accurate to note that depending on genre, the imagery will tend to be one type of medium over the other, or does that just completely depend on what each individual band wants to do or what they're looking to achieve with each album? I'm thinking more so like whether one band tends to use photographs over fine illustration more? Like, would you say
I think
that's
it really yeah, I think it really depends on kind of the individual band. Like, for example, Cannibal Corpse actually uses, like, I don't know if this is digital or traditional, but it looks like this almost watercolor kind of look, which is not what I would think of for like death metal. I would think of, for example, Carcass using more like photographs, um, and like a lot of bands kind of go back and forth. Like some bands like Ensiferum or Iron Maiden, that is, I'm pretty sure they each have like their own dedicated artist that they use each time for like, depicting the artwork. Whereas other bands, such as Judas Priest, for example, it's like they're kind of all over the map, and they're like doing like really different stuff on each album cover. When I was looking at, I was also looking at Halloween, and they also kind of are, they do like this and that. So it's just sort of, I think it depends on like the band and whether someone in the band maybe has like a specific vision of like, okay, I want it to look like this, and then they continue with that, or whether it's like, they're just, more focused on the music maybe. Oh yeah, I did want to bring up another band that we didn't talk about before was Battle Beast, and this is a good band to kind of look at in terms of how one person's vision might sway the artistic choices, because Battle Beast parted ways with like their songwriter after like 3 albums, and on those first 3 albums it's like they've got like a specific illustration style, and they've got like the same character on these 3 albums. Like, they want to use this character as like a symbol for the band. He's like this lion, half man. And then they split, and like Battle Beast the band is now no longer using that character, but like, so it's like the guy that left the band, it's like that was kind of his character and he took it with him. So it's just a good example of how, sometimes it's just like one person who's kind of like, yeah, I want to have this theme going on for like all the albums because I'm building this like story about this character, or I want to have some kind of consistency. Whereas with other bands it might be like, oh well, we want to try something new, or maybe we're going in a different direction, or let's switch it up a bit. So yeah.
So I think this was a very interesting episode to do then. Had a lot of fun discussing all of these different types of imagery and stuff. So thank you again, MJ, for joining me today on Lovely Talks Heavy. Where can people find you, and if they're interested in what you do, like just go ahead and just throw all your plugs and everything here. Go for it.
All right. So I am Snartha on most social media platforms. That's SNARTHA. So I'm on Twitter, I'm on Tumblr, I'm on Instagram. I have a webcomic called The Stoop Gallants, which I link to on like all my social media, so it should be pretty easy to find. If anyone wants to talk to me about metal albums or album art or art in general, then they're welcome to.
That's yeah, she welcomed me quite easily, I should say. So as far as this show goes, if you are new here, first off, welcome. Thank you. I know it's kind of bizarre welcoming people at the bottom of a show, but hey, thank you for joining us here on Lovely Talks Heavy. If you are interested in following me on my platforms, I am Lovely Metalhead on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, YouTube, and Mixcloud. One of the last 2 of which you should be listening to this podcast on. So follow me on those platforms and start a conversation with me. If you're interested in sending feedback to the show at all and putting forth your ideas or comments on what we discussed today, feel free to do that at lthfeedback@protonmail.com. I will read your feedback aloud on the show if you would wish. If you want to extend your support in a monetary fashion, I have a Ko-fi page. That is ko-fi.com/lovelymetalhead. Go ahead and drop a few dollars in there if you so wish or able to. If you're unable to, that's perfectly fine. Just sharing the show with a friend or 2 or 7, how many of our friends you've got. That is support well enough in itself. So thank you once again, MJ Alexander, for joining me here today, and thank you for listening. Until next week, next Saturday, here on Mixcloud.com, the next episode of Lovely Talks Heavy. You stay brutal, my friends. Goodbye.